So as a scientist, you have had the curiosity, the spirit, and the opportunity to become a pathfinder in your career. How about that?
And I even wore my rover shirt because I have had participation on every one of those except the little Ingenuity helicopter up here. I didn't actually work on that one.
Exploring life's journey, one story at a time. This is Trailheads with Jim Barrett.
Today my guest is Glenn Reeves, a NASA JPL engineer who's been helping humans explore Mars for the last 3 decades. He's worked on every major American Mars mission, from Pathfinder to Spirit and Opportunity to Curiosity and Perseverance. When he's not solving problems millions of miles away, Glenn's also a fellow hiker, proving his curiosity and endurance work just as well on Earth. Today we're talking engineering, exploration, and what it takes to keep going on Mars and on the trail. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Very much my pleasure, Jim.
So what was your first impression of SCV hikers when you first joined up for a hike?
I was of two minds. I was nervous, right? I was meeting folks I hadn't met before. I wasn't too worried about my ability to hike, but it turned out that it was a spectacular hike. And I, despite living in Santa Clarita Valley for 30 some odd years, I had never hiked up that canyon before.
You know what's funny about that hike? It's called Whitney Canyon, and for those who might be living in SCV and in the same situation, I was the same too. Is that I had lived there for about 10 years and had not. I mean, I wasn't a hiker really before that. I'd gone with my son's Boy Scout troop, but some buddies of mine pointed out that canyon out to me. And when I did the first official hike for SCV hikers in 2020, that was it, because it's a great one because it's only round trip maybe 3 miles. And it's
Yes.
not too steep, and it's got waterfalls on it, and in ideal conditions it does. But we had like 14 or 15 people on our first hike, which was fun. But that's a good one. And I'm glad you had a good experience, even with that small group.
Oh, yeah, it was a blast. It was very good. I think my only other little bit of trepidation is it was still mostly dark when we started.
Yeah.
So, and I have not wasn't much of a hiker before this, other than the Boy Scout activities. So I didn't even think to bring a light or anything like that. I think I used my phone for the first, 15 minutes until the sun had, popped up enough. That's what I recall.
I forgot that we're both Eagle Scout dads, right? We both had boys in Boy Scouts. How was that experience for you as a dad?
It was awesome. It was awesome. I had a great time. My wife had never been in a scouting organization when she grew up, but I was a Boy Scout. I did make it to first class.
Scouts was a great experience for me and my son. We really enjoyed that. And then his sister and brother joined us. You know, there were some camps camping trips that we did that were sibling friendly, and the siblings always loved that.
My daughter came out of the experience of her brothers being Boy Scouts wanting to be a Boy Scout because of all the fun things they got to do. And she was a Girl Scout, but the Girl Scouts weren't nearly as adventuresome. And my daughter, just her age-wise, she was just not quite. The Boy Scouts opened up to girls after my daughter had aged out. So she was really bummed out.
So how many kids do you have?
I have 4, 3 boys, 3 boys and my daughter.
Okay. And you know what I found out in the last couple of years of my son being a scout was about Adventure Scouts, which is co-ed. I didn't even know about that. And I think it was started in California in the 70s. So it's not like it was new. It had been around for a good while. But I learned about that when one of the scouting jamborees, for the very thing that, like what your daughter pointed out, is, gosh, the Girl Scouts just don't. And I'm sorry for any Girl Scouts out there but this is something I've heard a number of times, is that they wish they could have been a Boy Scout, and that's, I'm sure, what's led to the controversy of where we are today and everything going on with that. But it was a great, yeah. I'm glad we both had that experience, because it definitely was a good one.
Yeah, and it exposed us to what the wonderful, great outdoors really is.
You've been a great addition to the hiking group, SCV Hikers. And as someone who has both a passion for hiking, you've been a real team player also in assisting others on the trails. Where did that passion come from? Was it Boy Scouts or was it somewhere else?
So it's not overtly Boy Scouts. I think the idea of just helping and generosity is just part of my personality, right? I attribute it to my mom, but it's, to be quite honest, we're there as a team, right? As a group. It's the one thing I really like about SCV hikers is we really want to do it as a community. And that means, in my mind, that we don't have a string of folks that are, a mile apart from each other, that we we watch each other. We make sure we get across the streams without getting too wet. And we just make sure that everybody is having a good time. And I think that that's all part of it. And we do, there is no doubt we have taken some hikes where I wonder, I go, wow, that's pretty steep. This is going to be an adventure. But there's other times where it's, and we help each other. And I think that's the wonderful part. So does
Yeah,
that answer the question?
absolutely, because it kind of dovetails into what I'm going to ask you next, which is that some folks I think have tried us out before. And have been a little frustrated because we're not, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's stop taking pictures, let's get going. And I understand that there's some people who want to get on the trail and get down to business and get to the top of that mountain. And we're not that group. I mean, we'll get there, but we're going to help the people. We're going to help the 72-year-old who's over here, or the person who's got leg pain over here, or the person who's never hiked before. And man, you have fit right into that. I've got so many pictures of you assisting people who need it to get across that stream that's a little steep or a little full of water this week. And so I'm thankful for you. I'm really glad on multiple levels that you joined us. So one of the things early on, I have to say that this is my first interview with literally a rocket scientist. So I'm happy to have you here for that too, because I've always been passionate about the space program. I wanted to ask you, before we get into talking some about your career, what is your earliest memory of space?
My very earliest memory, 1969, July 20th. Right. I witnessed the television broadcast from the moon. I was 9 years old. And we were at a campground like 100 miles north of Toronto with my cousins. And funny enough, the only electrical outlet in the entire campground was an outlet for a men's shavers in the men's bathroom. And one person had brought a fairly small black and white TV up. And we watched the moon landing, myself and about 50 other people crammed into this bathroom. We watched it up there in that campground in the men's restroom. I would say that is the most impressed upon me first, thinking about space and what was going on. I would like to tell you that it inspired a path from that point forward, but in reality, it took me a lot longer to figure out that I was going to end up in the space business.
Well, do you remember what your emotions were as you saw Neil step down the ladder there? What you were thinking, other than, God, there's a lot of people in his bathroom?
I don't specifically, but I think my dad was holding me, or he had stood me up on either on a counter so that I could see over the heads in front of me, or I was on his shoulders. I do remember being up above.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And I remember my mom going, my gosh, this is amazing. I remember her saying that. And to be honest, she was probably the one that was more clairvoyant about what I would do in my future than I was. Because much later on, I ended up most of my career at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And there was a time where she actually told me, she says, Glenn, you're going to work there one day. But it was many years later.
Wow. What's the most misunderstood fact about what JPL does?
JPL has had just a phenomenal history of successes. And, it's that old adage that maybe we've been so successful we make it look easy. But probably the most misunderstood fact about JPL is it is really a challenging environment to go into space. And the amount of effort and the amount of difficulty and the amount of challenge to make it go right is really, truly phenomenal. I think the general public probably doesn't have a good feel for just how challenging that is. Most of the time, JPL is building one-of-a-kind spacecraft for the first and only time they will be built. So it's not like there's a practice set. It's really a dedication and a tenaciousness to make sure everything's right. And that probably is the most misunderstood part about what JPL does, is just how challenging the job really is.
So you started out there at a pretty young age. Can you tell me a little bit about what led to your first job officially at the Jet Propulsion Lab?
My mom had told me already that I was going to work there many years before, as I had mentioned, but I had ended up, when I got out of high school, I applied for college. My parents didn't have a mandate for what I would do in my life, but they did mandate that I would go to college. I was accepted at UC Santa Barbara, and that was where I was planning to go. That summer, I happened to meet a young lady that was impressed upon me. So I bailed out of Santa Barbara and went to one of my second choices, which was Cal Poly Pomona. And I lived in South Pasadena. Long story short, I went to Cal Poly, and my dad had given me a great piece of advice because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And he said, go to a college where there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of different majors, and take the introductory courses. And I did. I took introductory courses in accounting and hotel and restaurant management and computer information systems. And that one was like a little puzzle. I got to do our first little bit of programming on some very, very old equipment. And in the course of that, I ended up becoming a computer science major. The short end of the story is my advisor happened to live in South Pasadena also. And one day I was commuting from South Pasadena to Pomona, and I happened to be driving down one of the main streets, and I noticed him on the side waiting for the bus. And I thought to myself, well, he has class with me in about an hour and 25 minutes. I should go around the block, pick him up, bring him to school. And then something happened in my head, and I said, but if he doesn't make it on time, we give him a 10-minute grace period, and then we don't have to have class. So I didn't pick him up. Anyway, he did miss class. The bus was late, but I did go in and talk to him. And to be honest, I went in probably mostly to apologize to him for not picking him up. And he sort of laughed it off, and he then asked me, he said, do you want a summer job? You're doing pretty good in this class. Would you like a summer job at JPL? And that's how it started. It was the summer of 1981 when I was, I think I started there when I was still 20. And then I worked there part-time from that point on until I graduated. And then they offered me a job, and I took it. And I worked there most of my career with a couple years out in the middle where I went to work out in industry for a little while. And then I came back, and I've been there ever since.
Wow. So, wow, your mom really did have a good sense of that, because your meeting sounds like it was it's a pretty unique meeting. "Hey, I didn't pick you up," and then he's like, "Hey, you want a job?" So I'm
Yeah.
truncated all of that, but that's basically
Yeah,
how.
I was, and it was interesting because it was in a lab working with some folks that had a long heritage down at UCLA, working on computers that were designed to be what the terminology is fault tolerant, which means they're able to accept the fact that they get errors and then they correct them and then keep going. And much of my career was rooted in the fact that I had that basic understanding from these actual geniuses in the field that were working in the research part, because it turns out my first job at JPL was actually more research and less spacecraft. It was really a spectacular experience, particularly at the early part. I learned so many things.
I'm surprised to hear. I mean, that's kind of sounds like the baseline for AI in a way. I mean, but it also makes me think of when Neil Armstrong on Apollo 11 ignored the alarms and took over for the computer that was alarming him about something he didn't need, right? Am I
That's
right about
correct.
that?
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't remember the exact specifics of the story, but the alarm turned out to be effectively false, right? And he was able to land it the last 100 meters to the surface.
yeah. What is it that makes JPL unique compared to other engineering organizations?
I would say probably a couple of different things. Our mission is different. Putting it in perspective, today, there's a lot of companies that are going to space, a lot of commercial companies, and they're going to space for commercial reasons. JPL, as a center that is part of NASA, our job wasn't to commercialize space. It was to explore. And JPL in particular had the charge of doing robotic exploration. So we were outside the human spaceflight part of NASA. And I would say that the part that makes JPL truly unique is that exploration bent. Our goals are scientific. And that's why we tend to go to places that there's no commercial interest in going to. And often we're going to places where the difficulty of getting there really makes the first time doing it a really big and engineering activity that's very challenging, which is not exactly the way most commercial companies want to operate. They want to be able to build a flagship or a first unit and then go into production and produce many more of those things.
I believe it was 76 when Viking landed on Mars. Was the U.S. the first nation to land on Mars?
I think we were the first one to land successfully. but
Okay.
we were not the first ones to actually put stuff on the surface of the planet.
Okay. I want to do this. I want to ask you tell me about the missions, the familiar names of the missions that you were a part of those teams. Can you go down the sort of your resume of landers?
Sure. I did back in the early 1990s, I did a project called Mars Pathfinder. Mars Pathfinder is famous mostly for the Sojourner rover that we carried to the surface of Mars that drove around for coming up close on 90 days. And it was expected to be a mission that would last approximately 30 days. So that was my first foray. And to be honest, it was a very small project at JPL at the time. The rest of the lab was working on a big project called Cassini that was going to Saturn. And then that followed on with a pair of missions, the Mars exploration rovers, MER, Spirit and Opportunity. I was the flight software leader for the development of those. And then I've worked on Mars Science Lab and Curiosity and Perseverance in various capacities um, over the course of time. And then
Going
there's
back,
been a scattering of other missions in addition to those.
well, the ones you listed are extremely recognizable, at least to this space nut. Tell me a little bit about the landing system for Pathfinder, because I remember it was real just being fascinated by that when it was first being disclosed to the public.
Yeah, so the Pathfinder system was based on the premise that you could decelerate into the Martian atmosphere using largely the heat shield that we brought with us. And that would take most of our deceleration. And then we would go on a parachute, and the parachute would slow us down even more, a supersonic parachute that would go down to subsonic speeds. And then as we got close to the surface, very close to the surface, like within 15 or 20 meters, we cut ourselves loose of the parachute and land on airbags. And then we would bounce across the surface of Mars until we settled. And then we had a system that would drag the airbags in underneath the lander, turn the lander over itself if necessary, because it was a tetrahedron with the three panels. So we would right ourselves and then we would open. And some of the pictures of Mars Pathfinder, you'll see the bunched up airbags under the pedals that are part of the lander part of it. That was probably the most unique part of the landing system, was the use of the airbags and the amount of effort that we put into to make sure that they would be strong enough to handle the abrasion they were going to get from, because they might have hit with us moving sideways at a fairly decent clip. I can remember the landing day. It is indelible in my mind. And I can remember pausing and sitting there and waiting for that first little bit of radio signal to come back. And it was quiet. The entire room was silent. And then you heard the guy that was actually down at one of the DSN stations go, "We see a signal." And we knew it, and then it disappeared. And we realized what happened later is that the signal actually managed to hit the antenna on the Earth, but the actual spacecraft was still rolling. And it wasn't until later that we got the signal back after the lander had righted itself and had opened up.
How
So
much time elapses, or has that time changed from the 90s until, or is it the same amount of time that the
it
signal reaches Earth?
It's all depends on the distance to Mars at the time, right? During Pathfinder, it was like 7 minutes or 8 minutes. During some of the later missions, it's been as long as 20 or 22 minutes. When you think about that time delay and if you're math oriented and you start to figuring out the speed of light and how much that delay really means in terms of distance, you realize that Mars is really, really, really far away. But there's one of the weirdest things about it is if you think about it, and I thought about this actually on the Pathfinder landing too, is there was a moment in time where everything that had happened had already happened on Mars. And we just didn't know about it yet because the information was still in transit coming back to Earth. And at that moment in time, there's really nothing you can do. The future has already happened and it just hasn't arrived yet. That, by the way, is as close I'll ever get to time travel.
there was a video that someone produced that was called, I believe, 7 Minutes of Terror, and it's
Yes.
that lag between when the action occurs of the landing and how much time there is that you guys are on pins and needles wondering if it landed, and it's about 7 minutes that you were just describing, right? Am I accurate about that?
That actually, the 7 minutes of terror specifically is the amount of time it took that particular vehicle, which was Mars Science Lab, to go from the top of the atmosphere at Mars all the way down to the surface. It turns out, coincidentally, that was one of the times where Mars was much farther away from Earth. And so the actual delay was more like 14, 15 minutes. The terror part of that was all the things that actually have to happen so perfectly. There's nothing, basically nothing can go wrong during that period.
And that was a different landing system that you're talking about there, right? Was that the sky crane or was that also the bouncing ball?
No, that was the sky crane system. The sky
Yeah.
crane system is even more complex, but it has the ability to carry a lot more weight to the surface of Mars so we can have bigger rovers, in particular with more science instruments and things like that. Um, yeah, the sky crane is a pretty remarkable system because it effectively hovers, lowers the thing down to the surface, and then flies itself away, and leaves the rover on the surface ready to do its mission.
And going back, Pathfinder was literally only about so big, right? I mean, was only a couple of feet long or
Yeah, it was a little over if you stretch the pedals out and you measured from end to end, it was just a little over, I think a little under 2 meters across.
okay.
Yeah, so it wasn't very big.
So I'm jumping, like I said, I'm jumping around. I'm a time travel. I'm like Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-Five, you know, I'm unstuck in time. But when you were sitting there in mission control, when Pathfinder, your first, again, that was your first mission, right? As a scientist there, what was that
Yes,
like for you emotionally to see something that you'd worked on for a number of years finally make it to that alien world?
emotional. When we saw those first pictures appear and we were able to see this panorama of far distant peaks and near rock fields, it was pretty amazing. It was stunning, and I think I was a little bit of a pessimist at the time. I did the software. My team did the software for Mars Pathfinder for the spacecraft, and I think we had so much uncertainty about things like how dense the atmosphere would be and how well the parachute would work and these types of things that I wasn't actually convinced we were going to succeed, I don't think, when that day. And so I was extremely pleased that when he heard that first radio signal. That was amazing. But seeing the pictures, we recognized as a team that we're now part of history. And we're not even a footnote. We're going to be in the history books for a long, long time.
Well, and then you're gonna be in a Matt Damon movie decades later too, where people are reminded of your work.
Yes! Yes!
Yes, that's very true. And it's interesting that you would bring that up because I would say the emotion, my wife and I went to see the movie in the theater, and we sat like we normally do, sort of higher up in the back, about in the center. And when Matt Damon's character is digging the lander part of the Mars Pathfinder spacecraft out of the dirt, the emotion that I felt was way more intense than it even was on landing day. It was like seeing an old friend that I had missed for so long. It wasn't just me. Many of my colleagues that worked on Mars Pathfinder, we all had a very strong emotional reaction to watching that scene. Even to this day, even as I think about it, I still feel that a little bit because it would be really cool to go up there and dig it out. Although I don't think it's actually buried, but it would be really cool if at some point in the future that somebody goes and retrieves it and bring it back. I'd love to go see it in the Smithsonian.
How well did Andy Weir and his book, The Martian, and the production with Ridley Scott do with the making of that movie and getting the science right?
I can't speak to the overall survivability part, right? Because my human spaceflight world is pretty limited. They did a really good mock-up of the Pathfinder spacecraft. I spent hundreds, at least dozens of hours testing that camera to make sure, and its pointing, its ability to move and things like that. That was pretty phenomenal. The one thing I tell you that wasn't realistic, there was no little LED lights on it that blinked. when it started up. But weirdly enough, there was a sound the spacecraft made because it had relays, mechanical relays to turn things on and off. And when the spacecraft would start up, when the software would boot, you could actually hear all those relays move in a particular cadence. And we got so used to that cadence in the lab that you could tell if it didn't boot up right because it wouldn't have finished the sequence. The sound wouldn't have been right that you were listening to. And I found that was pretty amazing.
Well, congratulations on that and so many other victories. What role does failure play in the engineering process and sciencing these landers?
It's a predominant force. The fear of failure is a predominant force, particularly when you're building one-of-a-kind things and you're building them to go places where your knowledge of where you're going is actually quite limited. So it starts very basic at the point where you build the pieces of your system to have resiliency in their own right, either by strength, because maybe you'll land harder than you thought, or maybe the radiation environment in space that you're going to travel through will be more severe than you hope. So you select electronic parts that are more robust. Mechanically, you build in stronger systems, maybe bigger bolts, maybe, um, mechanical structures that are thicker than they might have otherwise had to be. So it starts with the basics of how you put the spacecraft together and then extends to building into the system the ability to react to things that are not catastrophic, but still failures. That arc of thinking about failure, what can fail? What can we do about it? Can we realistically detect that what's gone wrong? And then can we react accordingly? That is definitely a theme that is predominant across the entire development of the spacecraft.
What's the most creative workaround that you have taken part in or that you've seen or heard of even in high stakes missions like that?
There's been several. Yeah, what did they say is necessity is the mother of invention. The first one is actually a Mars Pathfinder one. We launched, and the spacecraft has the ability to identify where the sun is. It also has the ability to see stars, and it knows what time it is. And the combination of those three things allows it to know which way it is pointing. And once it knows which way it's pointing, it has a model of where Earth is in relation to the sun and the stars. And so you can do things like turn the spacecraft and point its radio antenna at Earth so that you can communicate. So we launched Mars Pathfinder, and we're watching it. And it turns out we launched on a path that allowed radio communication without us doing anything. It couldn't find the sun. And of course, that's a big deal because if it doesn't find the sun, the mission is over. We're eventually going to drift far enough away that we won't be able to talk to it. It would be the end of the mission. Luckily, we happened to have built the spacecraft so that it was fairly stable, not perfectly stable, but fairly stable. So we had some days. One of the things we did was we changed the software on board the vehicle 2 days after launch to change the check that it used on the one sensor that was partially working so that we could use that data. And from that point on, we were able to fly all the way to Mars. This is one of those things where you think about failure all the time, but you don't necessarily get everything right. It turned out that the way the spacecraft was released from the rocket was with a pyrotechnic device called a burn cord, which is basically a big long fuse that burns itself out. And it basically burns, and then and then springs push the spacecraft away. When it burned, it deposited a whole bunch of soot on top of our two sensors, and no one saw that coming. So we never expected a failure of that type. So that was a pretty creative endeavor to both figure out what was wrong, have an idea for why it happened, come up with a solution to fix it, and then turn around and fix it within a couple of days. It was the most adrenaline-filled one that I did.
That's still fascinating to me that you can still update the software after the vehicle has left Earth. And that's something that's been around, like you say, for 30 years now with what you guys were doing on the cutting edge, right?
Yeah, actually, it was in that same era where we, as JPL, for example, has practices that we write down that we try to follow with every spacecraft. And it was in that same era where we came to the conclusion if you can reprogram it, you should be able to reprogram it while you're flying. So that applies to the computers, it applies to some of the sensors we bring. Um, And it's become a standard practice.
Wow. Is there a mission that you were the most proud of?
The one that I look back on my career, and I'm probably most proud because I think on the Mars exploration rovers, the Spirit and Opportunity ones, I was again the lead for the flight software that went on the spacecraft. And in a way, it was an opportunity to do the software a second time because I'd already done it once with Mars Pathfinder. And we built into those rovers a lot of capability into the software, both getting us to Mars, landing on Mars, but then operating on Mars because we were a rover at that point. There wasn't a lander with a second rover. The rover itself was the whole system. And so we built into it autonomous navigation so that the vehicle could drive on its own. We put in place automation to allow it to communicate back to Earth without Earth intervention asking it to do that. We built up an infrastructure of capabilities that allowed it to be the overall software to be expanded as it was on the surface multiple times to add more and more capabilities. And so I'm really proud of those two vehicles because they lasted years and years beyond their lifetime.
Because they were
Uh,
predicted to only last a matter of weeks, and then, like you said, right? Is it weeks or months?
90 days, we were given the charge of being able to do the entire mission objectives in 90 days. And they, at least one of them was on the 7-year mark, and I don't remember where the other one made it to, but it was quite a long time. I'm very proud of those because I think the way we did the software and the way we thought about achieving everything in that 90 days really drove us to build an elegant system.
So, as a scientist, you have had the curiosity, the spirit, the opportunity, all of those things to become a pathfinder in your career. How about that? We just sort of
That's very good. That's very good. Yes, I have. Yes, I have. So, and I even wore my, my rover shirt because I have had participation on every one of those except the little Ingenuity helicopter up here. I didn't actually work on that one.
is it true? I think I heard somewhere the engine was it. Which one was it that was named by like a seventh grader? One of the later ones, I believe. We're
It could
seeing
have
on
been.
there. We've got What are the ones that you've got on your shirt there?
So this is Sojourner here. This is Spirit and Opportunity, Curiosity and Perseverance.
Okay, Perseverance was the one that did persevere in the end.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm a big Trekkie. Some of my first memories are watching the original Trek when I was really little in the late '60s with my dad. And I believe you have a similar passion for that, right? Was it you're a
I
Trekkie as
do.
well? Yeah.
I do very much. And I do believe I may have watched original versions of Star Trek, even when they first aired. I know I watched a lot of reruns later on, but I was in the right age groups to be able to watch it during that time. But I'm a big Star Trek, Star Wars fan. There's no doubt about it.
Well,
Yeah.
and LeVar Burton, who after playing Geordi LaForge, engineer, Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge on Star Trek: The Next Generation, beyond just being a sci-fi player, has also been a producer director for many years, and he played a role in one of your in researching one of your missions. Can you talk about that?
So yeah, actually, it was one of the most unique experiences that came out of me working at JPL. I was working Mars Pathfinder, and LeVar Burton was doing a documentary related to Pathfinder and space. But we met him. He came up into the development area. I don't think we had launched yet, and he came up and we talked to him about things. He was very personable, and he threw out the invitation that says if you'd like to come down to Paramount and see the sets and have a tour, and we'll just set it up. So I had a good friend who was our navigator for Mars Pathfinder, and he was an amazing Star Trek aficionado, and he set it up. He arranged it, and about 5 of us had the privilege of going down to Paramount and being escorted into the soundstage where they were filming a episode of Star Trek Voyager, of which LeVar Burton I think was directing, and it was and and he introduces us to the cast, And he introduced us as the people who were going to put the spacecraft on the surface of Mars, and we got a standing ovation from the cast.
Wow.
And that was that was pretty cool.
Yes.
But it gets better. So the soundstage is set up for multiple things related to Star Trek, because in the same soundstage or next door, I can't remember, was Quark's bar for DS9. And so as we're walking through, we end up in Quark's bar and we sit at the bar. And Rick Berman had heard we were there and comes over and wants to talk about space. And we want to talk about Star Trek. And I think we sat there for over an hour and a half in Quark's bar talking to Rick Berman. And
Wow.
that is truly probably one of the most special things that connected my real world space with my fantasy desired space. It was very cool. And actually, to be honest, on that same tour, I remember walking through a set where the Borg regeneration chambers were lined up along the wall. So I do remember that. And we saw Michael Dorn in the cafeteria in full makeup. So that was a pretty wonderful day.
How does working on space exploration change your perspective on Earth?
That's a really good question. It does two things, most notably, right? It makes you recognize just the sheer vastness of space compels you to think about how could we be unique in the entirety of the universe. And you come rapidly to the conclusion that we cannot be, right? That's the first part of it. The other part of it is that we also, in our very fragile little world that we live in, its fragility, the harshness of space makes Earth truly unique for us because it is so fragile. And we just don't know everything. And so exploration is so critical to just advancing humanity as a species.
What advice would you give to a young person who dreams of working at JPL or NASA? What advice would you give them? And I'm going to ask you a two-parter. I'm going to combine two questions here. If you were starting your career today, what would you focus on learning first if you were headed towards a career in space and aerospace?
Couple of things are important that are academic, right? You have to be able to communicate well. It's very helpful to have a good, strong background in science and mathematics. That's sort of my standard conversation I have with the fifth graders. But the other part of it that's super important is you need to be curious. You need to be driven to your answer to most things should be, how can I figure that out? How can I get that done? And I don't know how you nurture that, but I've certainly have seen it exposed, and I think it shows up actually in the really good teachers that introduce problems to be solved. For my own kids, I remember it was usually like the physics class where you had to build a bridge out of balsa wood and it had to survive. You know, you got the best grade if it survived the longest when somebody started stacking bricks on it. Or the egg drop, where you had to come up with a container that when they tossed it off the top of the science building, it survived or didn't, right? And you got multiple tries, so you could try more than once. So in answer to your question, the academic parts is the science and the math and the ability to communicate. But the other part of it is kids should be involved in things that require them to solve problems and to see challenges as problems just to be solved. I think that's really important.
I remember what speaks to that at the end of The Martian when you see Mark Watney getting back to the Earth and he's talking to students. He says something to the effect of, space is going to try to kill you. And, you get a problem and then you solve that problem. And then another problem comes along and you solve that one. And that's how you get to come home. And it sounds like you're speaking to that in a way that there's a lot of problem
Absolutely.
solving. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that is a great example of problem solving.
Can people who are not engineers, who don't maybe have those skills that are required to be a rocket scientist, an engineer, how can people who have a passion about space exploration, what can they do to support that?
Well, I think that you've actually said it, right? Ideally, they're proponents of the fact that exploration is important. There's a lot of important priorities for humans on the planet, for citizens of this country, right? There's lots of competing priorities, but let's not forget the fact that overarching to some degree is the fact that as a species, eventually we will have to migrate off this planet. And we shouldn't shortchange the fact that that's going to take a long time to figure out how to do. It's a matter of exploring our near solar system and then farther. The more we know, the better we're going to be. Right. And I think in the early 60s, when the space program was very much being established, and there was a charge given about, landing a human on the surface of the moon before the end of the decade, as a country and as a species, we should be putting challenges of that frame in front of us to do cooperatively. Doesn't have to be competitively, but we should be doing it cooperatively.
How much do you think science drives competition?
So the way you phrased it, I don't think very much, because you said drive science. If you said drive space or drive space exploration or drive space commercialization, I would say a huge amount. In fact, there is certainly within the U.S. right now, there is a big space race going on. Our intention is to beat the Chinese to the surface of the moon again. There is absolutely no doubt that is a motivating factor. Science is a little bit of a narrower needle to thread, right? Because science is for the purpose of understanding and exploration. That has gotten fairly short shrift with the current space system. For example, we have samples collected on the surface of Mars that might indicate signatures of life, but the mission to actually go retrieve them has been canceled. So when will they be retrieved? They might be retrieved by humans who actually land on Mars and pick them up in their hands, but we won't see them then for 15, 20, 30 years. Where if we did it robotically, we could probably see them in 5.
Right. I know that some of the more ambitious, knowledgeable scientists and procurers of the technology have said as early as now, in the next 5 years, we could launch a manned mission to Mars. But I think the more conservative and realistic ones seem to think it's going to be the mid-2030s by the time we get there. What is your educated guess about that?
I think it's later than I think it's later than the 2030s.
Yeah.
It's too far. We have to establish a sustainable presence on the moon first. And that's going to be both challenging, difficult, and expensive.
And that right now is Artemis, right? Is Artemis that next
It's
step?
Artemis, plus it's the work of there's new space stations going to come online. There's things that are on the ilk of sustaining human presence in space. But let me ask a different question for you, right? So human presence in space is one vector in humans migrating off. Another vector is discovering how unique is life in the universe. And we have these great opportunities in our solar system to go poke at that. Some of them are in sample containers on Mars. Some of them might be in the plume spray coming out of a vent on Enceladus, or slightly under the ice on Jupiter's moon Europa. There's all of these opportunities to go and if we go there and don't discover life, that's an indicator. If we do go there and discover life within our own solar system, then the ubiquitousness of life across the universe must be vast. If it's right here next to us, figuratively, not even in the next room, but literally right next to us, that would be profound. If we discover life on a different planet, on a different body other than Earth, that would probably be the most important scientific discovery in our lifetime.
Well, as you were touching on about Mars, that we're only now realizing with these more and more advanced rovers, the likelihood of life having been on Mars a good bit ago. When I was it was in the early 70s, so I was 7, 8 years old probably. My godparents gave me a book called The Answer Book, and it was a science book, but there was a lot of speculation in it too. It was kind of about where we were. Actually, the book, even though it came out in probably 72 or 73, seemed like the science in it was pre-manned moon landing. But it made a lot of leaps, I felt like. It was saying, we do not have life in our solar system, but maybe if we reach a distant star that we'll find it. And I remember even as a 7 or 8-year-old thinking, do we really know that? Do we really know for sure that there's not some kind of life, like you said, on the or Europa or on in the gas of Jupiter, or not human life, but some kind of life that we don't know. Could that be? And I remember thinking back then of what an arrogant statement that was, that we've already figured all this out when we just landed on the moon. How could we possibly know? There's just um, such a vast amount of science yet to be discovered, and I feel like we're just on the tip of that iceberg.
Oh, I agree 100%. We are very much on the tip of that iceberg. And technology-wise, we're now getting to the point where we're going to be able to do this actually more efficiently than we were able to do back in the like 60s, 70s, and 80s. Between the ability to program the vehicles, there will be some artificial intelligence component that'll help with the autonomy that needs to happen. Just remember, our conversation about light time and the fact that it took 7 minutes for signals to get from Mars to Earth. Pluto spacecraft, Voyager Beyond Pluto is it's more than a day of light time. I mean, it is literally so far away. And so we're going to have to build spacecraft that actually do things on their own without needing to confirm what's going to happen.
If you, as a scientist, could design a dream mission with no constraints, what would that be?
I would either go to Enceladus and sample the plumes looking for life, or I would go to the surface of Europa and search for life there. That would be what I would do. I really like the idea of, I worked on a mission design to go to the surface of Europa for 3 years. And it's a very complicated mission. It has a lot of unknowns, but the promise of potentially finding life, extent life that is there at the time, right, is just compelling to me. It would be one of those two. Absolutely.
Because it's an ocean world. It's one of the Jupiter's moons, right? And it is that the idea that there is an unfrozen ocean beneath that ice? It's not, we
Yes.
don't frozen solid, right?
No, it's not frozen solid. There is definitely a heat source that is at the core, and then there is a liquid ocean, and then there is an ice shell, and that ice shell is constantly churning. So there's some aspects of what that ice is made of is the ocean below it. So you may not find life that is actually living there, but you'll find lots of evidence of it in that ice. The problem is the surface part of that ice has been bombarded with radiation caused by Jupiter. And so you have to dig down far enough to get past that layer and get into the ice that would still contain remnants of what might have been living in the ocean.
How much of a role do these robotic missions, from Pathfinder all the way to where we are right now, how much of a role are those going to, and are they playing in preparations for manned missions?
So it's a medium role. There are certainly robotic missions that we've done that will never take humans to, right? Because the survivability of where they are is problematic. Humans aren't going to ever set foot on the surface of Venus. They'll probably never set foot on the surface of Europa. The radiation environment is just too intense. But we've used robotic missions to do a lot of exploration that it predicates ideas that we would need for humans to be there. Great example is there's an instrument that turns atmosphere into hydrogen that is, I believe, on the Perseverance rover. It basically is a fuel generator. And it'll have to be, of course, scaled, dramatically for the surface of Mars for humans to produce enough fuel for like their return vehicle. But robotic missions have been long used to explore places where humans then followed. Certainly has happened a lot on the moon. It's happening on Mars now.
You ready for a lightning round?
Sure, why not?
This is going to take us back to the combination of how we met with SEV hikers and your career of space exploration. So it's going to be a combination, and maybe a little sci-fi in there too.
Okay.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Favorite snack?
Favorite snack? Probably
And this can be
donuts.
hiking snack if you like.
Oh, hiking snack, it's granola or trail mix.
Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star Trek.
And why?
The underlying belief that humanity has evolved to actually being a force for good well outside of Earth. I think that's probably it.
Favorite Star Trek episode? Even if you don't know the name of it, tell me what happened in it.
It's the one I think called the Doomsday Machine.
If you could snap your fingers and visit any planet in our solar system, which one would it be?
Oddly enough, I don't think I would. If I could snap my fingers, I'd be on the International Space Station looking down.
Okay.
Right? I would like to see Earth from orbit. That if I only get one opportunity to do one thing, that's what I would do.
What's your favorite sound on a hike?
Probably the quiet trickle of running water.
Nice. What's your most fond hiking memory so far?
It's those mornings when you've been hiking in the overcasts in the fog, and you pop up and the sun is above you, and the vista of clouds looking out to the horizon is right in front of you. It's probably those.
Now this is similar, but this is probably more specific to a specific hike in your memory. What's your best hiking trail experience?
Wow, that is a tough one. When we went up toward Rocky Peak, right? And actually one of the ones where you at least were out for. There's the one where we took the picture and you're off in the distance with your arms up, and we're on the next peak over. I would
That's
say
Rocky.
that one I really, really enjoyed. That was a
Yeah.
great morning. But I can also tell you this last Sunday, where we went up to the Placerita waterfall, and it was such a technical hike to try to get through all the water and the crossings and everything. I really enjoyed that one too. It took us, probably twice as long as we would have done it if it was dry.
Who in history would you most like to have lunch with?
Wow. I'm not doing the lightning part of this very well.
That's okay. Editor.
That one's hard. That one is a really hard question.
You want to circle back to it?
Yeah, I would,
And if there's two or three, you can name the two or three.
it might be Freeman Dyson. I got to see him. He came and talked at JPL a couple of times, and I got to interact with him a bit. Man's brilliant. I would probably say I'd like to sit down and have a native language talk with Mahatma Gandhi. Talk about an influence of nonviolence across a spectrum of atrocities that span decades of time, and to maintain a dignity and an approach to change it's beyond inspiring to me. I don't fathom it. I'd have to ask, how did you do it? So it would be pretty incredible. I have a billion questions that I would ask my mom. Yeah.
While we're on this subject, I want to thank you because I lost my dad, and about a little over 2 years ago in 2023. And I remember one of the we didn't know each other we hadn't known each other very long, I should say. And you very kindly reached out to me and just, you said not a lot of words, but a few words it was an empathetic outreach. And I so appreciated that because like you're speaking about your mom now, there's times with my dad that I go to grab the phone to call him, to tell him, so I was like, oh, yeah, I can't. That's right.
Yeah.
It's such a do you feel that? Do you have that with your mom?
I do. There's questions that pop up that I didn't know I wanted to eventually ask, so I never asked them. And it's still there. I mean, both my mom and my dad. But Jim, my mom taught me empathy and generosity and to some degrees curiosity, but caring and things like that. And she taught me something super important about each of those characteristics, which is feeling it isn't enough. You have to take action if you want to help people. If you want to help, you have to take action. You cannot just hope that because you are empathetic in the way you feel, that'll somehow permeate into their world and help them. That doesn't cut it. You got to be more proactive to that. And took me a long time to figure out that lesson and that meaning, but it came from her. It was
Mhm.
just the way she was.
Mm.
So
What is your bucket list hike?
it has a vista at the end. It has a grand challenge in a stark environment. Like, hike to the end of the north side of Greenland and look across the 700-foot drop into the ocean, or to be maybe it's down through the Grand Canyon and up across to the other side, but or maybe it's a slot canyon that nobody else has been in that you know about, right? It's maybe it's hiking, 15 miles on the Great Wall of China. I don't have one. I have several that I would like to do, that I would really like to do. I went off on I know we're not supposed to hike on our own, but sometimes you're with groups of people that don't want to hike. And when I was in Norway, I had the opportunity to hike up to a top of a mountain that was, on the other side of it was a fjord that had a vertical face down to the water of several hundred feet. And I was able to hike up and over this mountain. And you got to the top of the mountain, which was, I don't know, 1,000 feet high or 2,000 feet high. And you had this vista of this whole coast of Norway. And then you got to hike down to the edge of the fjord. And I was all by myself on the edge of this 300-foot cliff, looking both directions, seeing no evidence of humanity in either direction.
Mm.
It was awesome.
As we conclude, first, I just want to say, Glenn, thank you so much for joining me and talking through your fascinating career, and also just about so many levels of our friendship, of being out there on the trails and just cutting to the chase of empathy and the emotions behind the hikes. I so appreciate you being so transparent and amazing through all of that, my friend.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you. Thank you for being so welcoming into the group. I mean, I've had a blast. So thank you very much.
Well, I look forward to our next hike because, as you know, my wife Elise and I come back a lot, and we have family in SoCal, and so we'll be back. And also, I want to extend the invitation to you to come out here because we've got some great hikes out here in Atlanta. And so the next time the girls come out, or on your own, or you and your wife, just know we should make that happen in the coming year or two.
I would really like that. That would be awesome.
Thank you so much, Glenn.
All right. You take care.
You too.